Welcome to Rebuilders. My name is Liddy. I'm here with Mark and Daniel, and currently no edible items, but they're on their way.
No.
Mark, I believe you have a confession for the listeners.
Well, I don't know if it's a confession.
I think it is.
I think it's a liberation.
It is.
Well, often we have, quite sort of, fancy pastries from, great Melbourne eateries. But today we're proving that we're a podcast of the people and we're breaking the Melbourne sort of hipster stereotypes. And we have ordered a dozen donuts from 7-Eleven.
Yes, we have.
And I will eat them with freedom. Freedom from judgment. Freedom from judgment.
It's worth noting, though, that 7-Eleven donuts are Krispy Kreme donuts. So they're not bacon donuts while topping up your car. They're freshly baked from Krispy Kreme.
Still
2 hours away in a factory.
digging yourself a hole there.
Yesterday at 4 a.m.
Well, now that we have revealed to you the secrets of the
inner workings of our pastry desires,
we'll move on to the content for the day. I just want to say a big thank you to all of our listeners who sent through questions for our listener questions episode, which might be more than one episode. We shall see as we go along. But the first question we might field is actually a question from the room.
Oh.
And the only other person in the room, aside from Mark and I, as you already know, is Daniel.
Hi.
Daniel, you have a question.
Yes, I one of the over the last 18 months, we have as staff, Lydia and I can attest to this. We have had the privilege
of eating donuts,
of having semi-regular COVID updates from you, Mark, as to what's happening here in Victoria and Australia, and particularly how that intersects with, I suppose, for us as pastors and leaders within our local church. What do we need to be aware of? What do we need to, decisions need to be made, and we'll be thinking about a couple months ahead and that kind of stuff. But I'd be interested I know you keep up with what's happening around the world and where I suppose COVID's at across the world. But what is there any kind of trends or kind of meta themes that you're seeing that will also translate to what the local pastors, wherever they find themselves?
Yeah, good question. I think there's a couple of things to note. One is obviously COVID creates an unpredictable environment, but then there's a sense of predictability in that much of what's happened is actually sort of very similar to the but how experts sketched out it would happen.
Sure. Yeah.
And where we are sort of now is, it was almost the first phase where it was just sort of containment. Then you had this second phase, vaccines came along and, you've seen waves of infection. You've got some place like South Africa, I think it's like fourth or fifth wave. Where I think we're entering into a new phase. So I think that's important for people. And really it's sort of variance where you've got some of the population vaccinated and others not. And what does that mean? So early on, all the questions people were asking were like, so how do we do church online and stuff like that?
Yep.
And then it was like, well, how do you regather depending where you are? And, what does it look like to do an embodied service again after you've done digital? Do you keep your digital stream going? All these sort of questions. But I think we're in a new phase now. And Delta has, been the sort of variant that they were worried about coming along.
Yeah.
So basically, again, this relates somewhat to our complexity from a complicated world to a complex world, is that in a complex world, the rules keep changing. So what variants do is they change the rules. And, the Delta variant has rapidly overtaken the world. If you think about its emergence in India, it wasn't that long ago. It was a couple of months ago, 3 months ago, just emerged. And already it's become the sort of dominant strain in the world. You've got Lambda in South America, which I think came out of Peru. That's changing things, and the rules change. It's more transmitted. You're seeing cases in Australia where people are getting it outside. If it goes into a house, almost everyone gets it, if they're not vaccinated. So what this means going forward is this creates a huge problem. So I think some of the thought was, for governments and people in leadership, and this will filter down to church leadership. But, there's a hope that sort of all, off sometimes viruses do peter out and sort of burn out. So, maybe with some vaccination levels and some, containment, it'll disappear. But really what we find, and even there was the thought around herd immunity, that if enough people get infected, we'll get to this point where it'll just disappear away. That all is possible. But really what we're seeing with Delta, places like Australia, which have done really well, and even some places in Asia, which have done well, you think Japan and Singapore and these places have found, Delta getting through the defences. So this presents a huge problem. We had recently here in Melbourne, you had transmission at outdoor sporting events. So, in the other wave, you could have outdoor events and stuff like that, limited, capped. But this is a game changer. So what's really interesting, I think the next phase that people need to prepare for. So first of all, some people will be listening to this. I know I spoke to some people in the US a few days ago and like, oh, wow, it feels like it's coming back. And I was talking to people a couple of months ago, in the US and some other place in Europe, talk about, now we're in the post-COVID era. And I was like, are we? And I think, Delta is, surging in the US at the moment. It depends what state you're in. And, haven't really hit the peak, which I think they're predicting is in September. Already hospitalizations happening. So you're going to see another wave. I think Germany is talking about, there's leaked documents this morning of Germany talking about going to lockdown again. So what you're seeing is this huge problem for governments. Obviously life has to, the economic cost of Delta is significant. And what you're seeing is interesting is, where this will go is that governments have to come up with a solution. How do you keep life going? How do you keep economy going with this thing going around, of getting 50% of the population vaccinated and some with herd immunity? It's not stopping it. So part of the problem that we're hitting is when you've got, say, 60, 70% of your population vaccinated, and then you've got 30, 40% unvaccinated, it creates what they call this sort of reservoir where the virus can just continue to spiral around and then adapt. So, it's going up to the person with, vaccination protection and it'll try this combination. Then it doesn't work. It tries that combination. Now, you think of every single person in the world at this point in time with COVID and just how so the virus learns. The virus is adaptable. And that's where you get variants from. So we're currently in a Delta phase, which means that what that's saying is it's becoming unfeasible to go, oh, look, whoever wants to get the vaccine, just get the vaccine and we'll be protected because there is some vaccine, some small vaccine escape at this stage so that people, with vaccination still may get infected. But what that means is that the unvaccinated segment of the population presents a threat to the rest of the population. Just say you've got 30% unvaccinated, 30% unvaccinated with a raging pandemic going through them still can overwhelm a health system. Like a lot of people don't realize, major cities still only may have a couple thousand ICU beds. And that means, the people with heart attacks, the people who, have a stroke, the people who have an aneurysm, car accident, falling accident, whatever, they're not going to find beds. And that's already happening in some states in the US, and you're seeing that in places in Europe and other parts of the world. So you can see the thinking of the governments, how this is going to affect churches. The thinking of governments is already like, okay, we've got to come up with some solution for this. And there's pressure from industry. So, for example, here in Australia, you've got the big sporting codes whose money is based on backsides on seats. You've got, the big airlines, the travel industry. You've got the theatre industry. You've got shopping malls. You've got music venues, concerts. I mean, just to go on concerts one sec, so there was sort of the test case. I think it was that outdoor concert in the Netherlands, which I think they, we'll have, come in if you got a vaccine passport or you got a negative test, and there was like, something like 1,000 people got COVID from it. And then, they've just had Lollapalooza with Limp Bizkit.
Which the fact that they still are around is most amusing to me.
110,000 people in Chicago. There was I think it was Rolling Loud concert. It was like a week ago in Florida, which, now there's like Florida is surging. So even when you're sort of putting these mitigations like a negative test, that what that's doing is still, unless it's really tightened and you've got unvaccinated people there or people who may get the virus but are protected from serious illness with the vaccination and then take it back to unvaccinated people in their household, there's problems. So where all this is inevitably going is towards vaccine passports. And I think New York today mandated vaccine passports for, I think, restaurants and eateries and gyms. You're seeing that happen in multiple jurisdictions around. In France, the French government's indicating where this is going to go. The Australian government's, had some leaks. You got to love a strategic leak to warn everyone before something happens. And so basically they're going to, where this gets to is versus like going into people's homes and jabbing them, which is not going to happen. You create this incentive system where, only certain things are accessible to you. You can only fly domestically if you're vaccinated. All this is going to happen. I think. Now, where this will filter down for churches is it is very possible, again, to different jurisdictions listening to this. So we've got people all over the world. So recognise the complete diversity, and even within countries, something that may happen in Alberta in Canada may not happen in British Columbia or Nova Scotia. But I think that you're going to see a pattern across the world of vaccine passports already happening in some places. This is sort of how China's doing it, where your phone will be green or red. And that could be brought in with churches. If it's brought in with public spaces, there is a possibility that may be mandated in some environments for churches. Okay, so if you're a pastor hearing this and it says, this is my little thing, you need to prepare for how you lead through that. Now, there's all the stuff around, people listening like this. There'll be everything from bring it on to, oh my goodness, rights here. Again, to there's a diversity of political opinions listening to this show, I'm sure, because we've got people listening all over the world. But more, I guess, without going into all of that, I would say more start preparing in your mind of how you will lead a church where perhaps coming to in-person worship could require a vaccine mandate that maybe is mandated by the state or the city or the whatever, which could mean, you think about that going forward. So it could mean that you continue to do digital church for those who don't want to get vaccinated.
Yeah.
How do you lead through that? In some countries which are more polarized, in France, there's huge protests. There's a big issue in the US, probably less so in places like Australia and New Zealand. But you've got, that's going to be another political hot potato. Theologically, people will be arguing, what does it mean if we exclude the unvaccinated? You hear all this sort of stuff. Again, not necessarily giving you any answers on how to lead through that, because I think it's, you've got to follow the Lord in the environment that you're in, with the laws that are over you. But I would say start thinking about it now. It could be 6 months away, it could be a year away. But I think what we're seeing now is COVID is not going away. I saw for the US to get fully vaccinated to the point where to reach 70%, which even still, a lot of experts are saying, with Delta, we need, 90, possibly 80, 90. I think they'll get there at current rate by April 2022, I think, So that's if everything goes well. Now, the other thing that no one is really thinking yet, but again, we have to be prepared for, is a new variant. Now, it could burn out. That happens with things, but there could be an even more infectious variant. And there was some modelling done by, I think, SAGE in the UK, which is sort of government body, saying that there is a possibility that one will come that will have the high transmissibility and even higher deadliness. So again, we have, I think if you're thinking life is going to return to some sort of normality very soon, it's not. I know in the UK there's some drop-off in daily cases and hospitalizations, but again, these things don't go in a straight line. It's exponential bursts and spurts. Some of that could be also because they had a huge spike with, if you look across Europe, there was spikes. Really interesting. So quick side fact. After the football Euros finals in Europe, there was a spike in COVID, which we know is linked to the Euros because it was primarily around, I think it was men 18 to 35.
Yeah, interesting.
Who were gathering. And pretty much before then, genders got it equally. But then for the Euros and a few weeks after, it was almost, it went 60% men getting it. So that shows us that there's these cultural dynamics. So again, we don't know if that drop-off is, following on from the Euro. So long and short, be prepared for vaccine passports. How would you manage that? Some people will be listening to this thing, I never thought we'd go into lockdown. That may happen again. And an unpredictable future, which is really what this podcast has been trying to communicate to people.
To be agile and flexible.
Yes, exactly. And to reframe this as opportunity. When many people who listen to this in the developed world, we accepted the fact that, hang on, we're sort of like, going to have this stable, privileged life. This is how most of humanity have lived, and I think there's an opportunity in the midst of this. There's your update, Daniel.
No, that's good. It's helpful. And it's kind of indicative of one of our previous episodes of the complex world we're still living in. It's not going back to just a complicated linear thing. We're going to continue to live in this reality.
Yes.
So adjusting accordingly and yeah.
Yeah, amen.
Well, we just had a little pause for the donuts and they were nice.
They went really quickly. We
inhaled them.
Gone.
Dozen each.
That is a lie.
It's the staple diet of every builder's host.
But whilst we were eating them, you had a thought that you wanted to add.
Just on the, realizing that after after that update, it is challenging, but it's just interesting. I think too, like being a leader, is also being attuned to what is happening in the environment and how can you marry what God is doing, inviting people into and what's happening in the environment, even when it's challenging. I was watching our local news here the other night, and we'd just come out of our 5th lockdown.
Yep,
that's a lot, and I don't know about you guys, but like it's almost like in the last, even in our church congregation, it's like once we got to the 4th lockdown, it's like something just clicked, and it's like people are like, all right, this is life now, and you could see their values and their worldview changing. And so on the news, it was just interesting. They were like, it was interesting they had a news item about not going into lockdown, but Melbourne's coming out of lockdown. But they just went along, I don't know if it was Montague Street or something in South Melbourne, I can't remember where it was, and they were like, it was just interviewing people like, what are you doing? And there was like a family catching up in a cafe, which you can do now, and, they were like, how are you experiencing this? And the guy just said, look, I think with life now, I'm just happy, even if I'm just catching up with my family and I'm just happy about this now, know. And there was another guy who was just sitting out the front of a pub thing, having a beer outside with his mate, and he's just like, mate, this is life now. I'm happy. There's the sun's out, the footy's on in the background. I'm having a beer with my mate, and and I watched and I thought, wow, this is a fascinating recalibration, because you go back 2 years ago in Melbourne, there's this expectation you'd be doing all these amazing things, jetting around the world, going on these events, running around like a headless chicken. And I think in our city, at least, I think you're seeing this recalibration. I think we've seen that in church, where almost like there was this whole thing of like waiting to get back to normal. But then I think there's a realization like, this is what it is. I got to push into my faith. And so I think that as much as, and perhaps even for areas thinking, oh my goodness, we thought this was over, we're going back into lockdown. What are the opportunities in that and what God is doing in people, I think there's one thing about this virus, you look at even parts of the world which, almost fell into a bit of hubris, like, oh, we've beaten this, and then it's come back. There's an element, there's a humbling, but there's also an openness where people, I remember, I don't know if you remember, Terry Walling said, it takes a certain time for a pattern to be established.
Yeah.
And that was a few months ago. And he's like, we're well past that now, 100 days or whatever. I mean, we're 18 months, So in 2 years, like really, there is a new world is now baked in. So how do we sort of adjust? We can't, what can't we control? We can't control these bigger things happening in the world.
Yeah.
But we can control our response, and we can control how we lead people into the invitation of how God grows us. And, C.S. Lewis said, God speaks to us most loudly in our pain. And, I think there's, this for leaders, there's all the frustrations, the disappointment, there can even be fear. But there's something happening in people, not everyone, but there's something happening in people. And I think leaders at this moment are tuned to, you need to just have your little sort of radar out, okay, there's a change in that person. God's doing something, or they're softened, or, so I think that's a really helpful way, I think, to reframe this moment.
Yeah, that is super helpful. Great. Well, let's move on to a listener question from Joel. The current season of Rebuilders is amazing, with Rebuilders being geared more toward church leaders. What would you like to discuss if there were a current episode of this cultural moment? What shifts and movements do you see happening that will affect and influence cultures within the next few years?
Wow, great question. That's a very good question. Okay, if I was to do an episode of this cultural moment now, okay, so I guess really the question is like, what are the broad sort of trends that any person in the world needs to be interested in? I think with this cultural moment, I think part of it was analysing and interpreting some significant cultural changes that were happening.
Yeah.
Some of that was in response to some of the sort of political surprises, Trump election, Brexit, these sort of things. Also some of the questions around, obviously we were doing it in Portland. What does it mean to follow God in cities like Melbourne or Portland? And how do you do that? And how do you just understand all these different things that are happening?
Sure.
So I feel like in some ways what it was interpreting and commentating on a big cultural change that's happened. If I was to do an episode of Cultural Moment now, I would, really the question is, what are the next changes that we need to be attuned to? I think we moved through that period and almost some of the roots of what's happening now lean back to there, but then there's also some disruptions from what was happening there.
Yeah.
I cast my mind back to, I think it was an episode where we talked about, this idea that, so in Portland, there's Powell's bookstore, the iconic Powell's bookstore. And, I think we'd been in there and there was this wall of books. I think I talked about there's a wall of books and they're all sort of proclaiming, this huge disruption in the culture, worrying about the rise of fascism and, environment and all this sort of stuff. And the sort of like contradiction of then going back to, John Mark and I would catch up, we'd meet at Heart Coffee before and talk about what we're going to talk about and then wander up and record. And I think we told the story, there was this Danish girls who were sort of visiting Portland and there was a Portland young woman sort of explaining to them like, democracy is in danger, and they're sort of listening to her. But sort of like, I think we talked about the, dichotomy of like, well, you're looking around Portland on a sunny day, this sort of like, it looked really nice and there's good coffee and this sort of, gentrifying urban space that's sort of trying to sort of chart a new kind of sort of city and stuff like this. That's changed.
Yeah.
Portland has changed as many places around the world. And I think that line of like, well, there's this fear in the culture and this fear of change, like we've now actually seen disruption, and COVID being one of the key drivers. But again, too, you look at Portland and, all that sort of went through in 2020 and, I obviously haven't been back to Portland because I haven't been traveling, but, just talking to some friends there, just saying downtown, there's parts that are boarded up and different things going on. It's really quite transformed.
Yes.
So in a sense, looking back at this cultural moment, in some ways it was sort of like predicting what could possibly, or getting people up to speed with the changes that happened. So I think the first thing is in a sense, like you could look at like this cultural moment was like phase one. And so, I think also like phase one was almost, there is this new sort of mood in the culture. Cultural Christianity is going, sort of almost this dominant culture, particularly in terms of government and popular culture, of almost these sort of progressive values. How do we as the church be faithful in such a place? And, particularly I think, churches like, Red, Bridgetown, other churches around the place who were, sort of preaching the Bible, trying to be faithful in a church and be culturally conversant and sort of trying to continually to be formed in sort of a counter formation to the ways the world would slowly form us.
Yes.
So the things then, the disruption of the mobile phone, the disruption of personalized anxiety that we may feel. I feel that's radically changed. Phase two is radical disruption, where it's no longer just about the disruption of the mobile phone or the fact that, you're overwhelmed with FOMO, fear of missing out, or, there's a bit of pressure in the media against Christians. Really, I think the dynamics that we've spoken about, probably since then on this podcast around a networked world, decentralization, they've really kicked into gear.
Yeah.
And in some ways sort of that, Trump era disruption sort of over, but then there's been a definite new direction charted. And it's much more sort of like unknown and unpredictable. And I think in some ways, part of the invitation then as well for Christians that, it's the disruptive world has this ability to undo you at a rapid rate. Whereas if before it's like, how do we be in these environments? How do we be a church in a city like Portland or Melbourne or San Francisco or London or whatever? How do we be a believer working perhaps in a secular field in one of those places? Well, we need to make sure that we're just stepping into these formational rhythms. 2020 happens, COVID, everything. And it's just like, it's such hyper speed and so disruptive, almost that sort of slow pattern. And I know people are pushing into that and just got completely disorientated by the pandemic because, you didn't have those patterns that you could keep pushing into.
Yeah.
And I think that the big trends, like I said, to answer the question, the big trends, I think that obviously COVID is continuing. I think, it could continue on. It could, at least go another sort of 6 months. That's probably very optimistic. That's changing the world. That's changing cities. If you go back to this cultural moment, it's like, how do you live in cities? Cities are being fundamentally changed. I would also look at, I think politics is one of the things we talked about is polarization. And it's really interesting. There was a fascinating Pew research done recently about, put some on my Instagram, about polarization around the world. And what it said is that countries, it's fascinating. So basically, the United States has become more polarized since the pandemic. Netherlands has become more polarized. A number of European countries more polarized. But then interesting, like Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, less polarized. Really fascinating. You think Australia has the same social media. Australia has 80% of the same TV shows.
Yep.
Australia speaks English. Like we're awash in American culture. We've been through the pandemic. We've been through multiple lockdowns, mask mandates, all this sort of stuff. We're also in a historic conversation around race. We've had, whole things around, like gender equality in federal parliament. So a lot of the same sort of fractious arguments are there, yet we've emerged more unified. So fascinating. And basically what Pew was saying is that part of that is around sort of competency in government.
Okay.
And because Australia, New Zealand, in a sense that those countries which in a sense the government has more competently kept deaths down, kept the economy going, have actually found themselves more unified out of this process. Now, we'll see, again, COVID's an unpredictable future. We'll see what happens with that. But I think one thing that is a big trend is going to see, particularly what you're seeing is there is a significant shaking occurring in Western Europe, and include the United Kingdom in that, and the United States that is occurring in this phase. That is more disruptive and more shaking than was occurring in the cultural moment phase.
Okay.
And, greater polarization. But then that's also happening. The other big trend I would point to is geopolitics. Mm-hmm. The rise of China is a huge thing. And I talk about it a bit because I think that people don't estimate really what that means.
Yeah.
And again, since the end of World War II, the world has been defined by, what Henry Luce called the American century. Mm-hmm. In a sense, we're moving at, and that created an American-led world order, World Bank, everything, Coca-Cola, popular culture, Hollywood. We don't realize how much even people who live in other countries are defined by the American century. But that is passing, and we're moving into a much different sort of like, I think, cultural phase. The American sort of right-wing pundit / firebrand, late Andrew Breitbart, had a statement which is often repeated, which is that politics lies downstream from culture. Mm. And I would actually reposit that as culture lies downstream from geopolitics.
Yeah, okay.
You're seeing China, the projections are it will double the GDP of the US in the next 10 years, or get beyond. It's going to be richer. That's going to have an effect in the world. So I think geopolitically, the fact that we could see more conflict in the world geopolitically, that has significant changes. The other thing I would keep an eye on too is I think the environment is going to be a huge thing. Currently we're, as we record, there is major fires. They're kind of like what we see in Australia. We're sort of a little bit used to it, grown up with it. But you're seeing that now around the Mediterranean. Mm. You saw record temperatures being set in, I think it was, Canada's Arctic Circle, heat waves in, northern parts of Canada. The environment will be an increasingly disruptive disruptive force in the world. If you it's the uninhabitable earth by, is it David Wallace Wells? If you read that, if he's getting 10% of it right, it's a disruptive future. If he's getting 100% right, oh my goodness. So I think that's going to be, one of the big things. And I think also COVID, increased geopolitical tension, the environment, all of that changed this sort of free world of movement that I think really came to an end, in March 2020.
Yeah.
And, even the supply chains issues that we're experiencing in the world at the moment, what the American century did is create this giant networked world. And really the dream was, in a sense, that place could be, this free-flowing trade, information, liberty, capitalism, but there's an increasing, how does that operate under much more emergency scenarios, if that makes sense?
Yeah.
The other thing too is I think that what we're going to see is an increased, this is a prediction, whereas phase one of of this cultural moment, there was a lot of talk about progressivism and, progressivism in terms of, as perhaps, around sexuality and these sort of issues, identity politics and so on.
Yeah.
I think we're already seeing as the biggest critique of a lot of these sort of progressive, people call it in inverted commas woke stuff, is actually now coming from the left, is really interesting. And what you're seeing, if you sort of keep an eye on who are the sort of culture setters, I predict we're going to see a return to a more economic left. After the GFC, if you look at, so the return of sort of, left parties around the world who are more economically focused, the GFC sparked that. When you were going through these years of economic boom, left parties really struggled. You had, the sort of emergence of this middle way, sort of, Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, sort of, where you had like almost, left-wing social politics, left-wing sort of almost identity politics meets right-wing sort of capitalism. I think with the economic effect of the pandemic, and that's what a lot of people aren't speaking about, like we've been spared the economic effect of the pandemic because effectively we're printing money.
So really we've not been spared it.
Yes.
The ramifications will just come later.
Yeah. There's something like something insane, like the quarter of the money in the world is printed in the last year. Like it's unbelievable. So there's a lot of people saying we're in a bubble. Again, I don't know what that looks like. Is that a massive depression or is it just an ongoing recession? So I think you're going to see the issue of economic inequality married to with issues of corruption around the world, economic corruption, endemic and entrenched. And you're going to see an increasing movement, questioning those things around economic inequality. I think that's going to be huge, perhaps in, sort of a couple of years, particularly if the economic effects, people job loss and stuff like that because of COVID. A lot of the economies which have kept young people in work are dependent upon movement and stuff like that, and COVID has stopped a lot of that. So I think that how would I sort of summarize it? The cultural moment sort of analysis I was trying to do was, the world's changing. That sort of, 90s, we're just going to move to utopia world and, you can have a great church and let's be relevant and the world's going to love you. And I was trying to say, hang on, relevance doesn't cut it anymore. You now need to be resilient, if you like, in these sort of like secular soil of these cities. Now everything's being disrupted, even secularism. I mean, COVID eats individualism. COVID, secularism is based on the world continuing to, deliver this life which is wonderful that you don't need God. And that's all being disrupted. So I think this phase is much more disruptive. Having said all that all sounds very dire and challenging. It's already in donuts.
I was going to point that out.
Yeah. This is an upper. But again, mega themes that often is said in this podcast: crisis precedes renewal.
Yeah. And
it's these moments of tension that God always turns things around. And particularly, I just want to say too, births new kinds of leaders. Hard soil becomes holy ground with the presence of God.
It's good. And yeah, so timely and so important to come back to. Thank you so much for exploring that. There's a lot to get through there. we will continue with another episode of Listener Questions. Thank you for tuning in to Rebuild Us today. We're going to go and eat some more donuts.
We just got through one question. We need to eat more donuts so we can answer more questions.
Well, technically there were two. It's just that
yes,
one
true.
was fielded from our very own Daniel.
Yes.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, listeners.